We're very fortunate to have Robert Halfon with us. He's had a really successful career as a Member of Parliament. Robert was Skills Minister, Minister of Skills and Apprenticeships until June of last year, and is now Chair of the Education Select Committee. Robert and I have met on a couple of occasions. Robert is really good at asking tough questions. He asked me, what's the difference between social justice and social mobility? And I still haven't come up with the answer. Now, I can vouch for the fact that Robert is a huge supporter of apprenticeships. So let's give Robert a big hand.
Good morning, everyone. I just have these for the free parking outside. So, it is a huge pleasure to be here today. I don't want this to turn into a mutual loving, but I have huge admiration for the Sutton Trust, and it's very hard to say no to anything they asked me to do. And I remember when I got elected to chair of the Education Select Committee, first thing Nick Gibb said to me, the schools minister, was say you must regularly talk to the Sutton Trust. So you're held in high esteem by people from all parties and none. And thank you for what you're doing in terms of apprentices. Now, we have a distinguished panel before us today, and I'll introduce them just after my remarks. But I just want to pose a number of challenges. I'm passionate, as you've just said, about social justice. In fact, I think social mobility is like a mobile telephone advert for Vodafone, because I believe that social justice, actually what it does is it brings people to the ladder of opportunity, helps them climb up, and it makes sure that it is there if people fall off. And I think social mobility often applies to people who are already mobile. But I think that our committee is dedicated to addressing social injustice across the education system and to addressing our skills deficit, which remains huge and behind many developing countries. And I see apprenticeships as very much part of that ladder of opportunity. And to me, there are 5 rungs of that ladder, starting off with prestige, and changing the culture around apprenticeships. Secondly, social justice. The third, quality. The fourth, dealing with the levy. And the fifth, job security and prosperity, which of course is the purpose of doing an apprenticeship. And I congratulate the apprentices who've just spoken. Well done. Now, we will never achieve what we need to achieve unless we change the culture and prestige around apprenticeships and technical education in our country. And this needs to happen in a number of ways. Firstly, of course, policymakers, opinion formers, think tanks need to be having many more conferences and talking about apprentices and technical education and the value of it. And that needs to be an ongoing conversation that happens almost every day to convince younger people and their families that apprenticeships and technical education are as good, and in some cases, if not better, than going to university. But the other way that we will change that is to, in my view, have a radical change in how we do careers in our country. And I think that careers should be directed primarily towards skills. I think there are careers organisations out there getting substantial funds from the government, often doing good things, but often duplicating each other's work. And what I think needs to happen is that we need to set up a national skills service, which goes into schools, that we need to have a proper UCAS for FE, as was promised in the Conservative manifesto. And we need to have, this National Skills Service would have a website which would have all the best FE, the FE courses that are needed, the apprenticeship courses on offer, and of course university. And the other thing that we need to do is to boost what I call my 2 favourite words in the English language, and that is degree apprenticeships. Now, I'm passionate about all apprenticeships, whether anyone does a level 2, level 3, I want to see progression. But the reason why I think degree apprenticeship should be the strategic aim of the government and the Institute for Apprentices is because it creates a cascade, a domino effect. I'm mixing my metaphors here, but a cascade of prestige all the way down through through every level of the apprenticeship system. And at the moment, it seems that whilst we have some a few thousand people doing degree apprenticeships, there are enormous complications, and universities write to me saying they're tied up in bureaucracy. And we had the IFA come to my committee, and the chief exec said that he was agnostic about degree apprenticeships, and I thought that was profoundly wrong, because I think it should be the strategic aim of the government to have many more and solve the problems like that are affecting nursing degree apprenticeships and the like. Not just for the prestige, but it also answers the problem of tuition fees, student loans, and also helps us develop a skilled economy. And I was delighted, in fact I was over the moon when Cambridge University decided that they would have degree apprenticeships. I'm saddened that Oxford remains closing the door to technical education and degree apprenticeships, but I hope they change their mind too, because as I say, this will create that cascade of prestige. The second rung of my ladder is social justice. Now, one of the reasons why I was so passionate about apprenticeships, and I have employed apprenticeships. I started an apprentice scheme in Parliament, employing full-time apprentices in my office when I was elected as MP, and I made my maiden speech on it, is because I went to a visit with Catch 22 in my constituency, even before I was elected as a parliamentary candidate, and was struck by how many young people they were looking after who wanted to do apprenticeships but couldn't find them. And it really made me understand that this is an incredible ladder of opportunity for social justice. Now, currently 25% of apprentices come from the poorest fifth of areas, and we need to make that much higher. And I welcome suggestions of an apprentice premium, as the Learning and Work Institute, a brilliant organisation, have put forward. And I do think we need to look at a possible levy fund for this. I welcome that the government have introduced bursaries now, or small grants for apprentices who've come from very vulnerable backgrounds. But we need to do a lot more on this. And the careers, again, changing careers, all links back to careers in the schools, I think will also help. I hope very much, and I keep urging the government to do this every time they appear before our committee, that they implement the manifesto of giving travel grants for apprenticeships from disadvantaged backgrounds. This is incredibly important if we are to encourage people from, in terms of social justice, more apprentices. Now, the quality issue is another challenge that we face. I mean, you will have all seen the Times report over the, I think it was a couple of 2 or 3 months ago, that highlighted what Ofsted had said, which was something like nearly just over 50% of apprentice organisations that they had providers that they had inspected required improvement or were inadequate. I think it was 40% require improvement, 11% were inadequate. They assessed 189 providers. 6 were outstanding, 43% were good. 10% of apprentices did not even know that they were on a course. And clearly there are problems. I know there are wonderful providers out there. I go to many FE colleges. They're providing outstanding work for apprentices. I know that there are many private providers out there doing an incredible job. And, I remember going to Middleton Murray, an amazing private provider, and there are many other examples that I know that people can quote. But nevertheless, there's clearly a problem there, and it's something that our committee is looking into as soon to publish a report into the quality of apprentice training. Ofsted need more resources. We need to look at the level of subcontracting. I've never understood why it is that if you pay someone to do something, you then get a top slice of taxpayers' money to then pass that job on for somebody else to do. And of course, there'll always need to be some subcontracting and some niche subcontracting in certain areas, but it's got to be curtailed, and we have to give Ofsted the resources to inspect all subcontractors as well. Now, the fourth challenge, of course, is the levy. And I am a supporter of the levy because I believe that it changes behaviours. I have thought about this a lot. It's amazing what you can think about when you're not a minister and what you're able to say. But I think that some of the suggestions from the EEF are serious and need to be looked at, particularly in terms of increasing the amount of levy that can go to the supply chain from 10% to 50%. I think that would be important. I think we do need flexibility regarding the 20 hours. Again, nursing, one of the problems of having more nursing degree apprenticeships is because they have to have much more than 20 hours according to international standards. I also think that maybe we should consider that companies can take longer to use the levy, because clearly there are a number of problems, and we need, I agree with them and have said this for a long time, that we need to incentivise both, as I mentioned a moment ago, young apprentices from disadvantaged backgrounds in terms of social justice, but also we desperately need to encourage more women doing STEM apprenticeships, which is very low. And so I think we need to look at the system in the way that we can incentivise. And the question I pose is, should we get rid of the 3 million target? Now, I kind of believed in a target because it concentrates the mind of the Treasury in terms of funding, but perhaps we don't now need to look at this and say, is this just impacting on quality? And what we need to see is quality apprenticeships, that people don't just start at level 2, but they progress all the way through the system. And I think the work that the EEF has done is very important and should be looked at quite closely. And finally, the final rung of the ladder, the whole purpose of this is job security and prosperity. So we need to look at clearly, we know that 90% of apprentices are getting jobs in the companies that they work for, or going on to additional education, which is a great thing. But what I want to know is what kind of jobs, what kind of pay. We need to look at that much more, and what levels of progression, because I believe that people should be, once they start one level, should be given the chance to progress all the way through. And it may be that we can be flexible about, I think it's up to £27,000 that companies are allowed to use for each individual apprentice. It may be that needs to be higher if we allow apprentices to progress all the way through from level 2 right up to higher apprentices and degree level. And I think we can do this. I think there is a change of behaviours. I think there is something big happening in our country, but I really do think we need to solve the problems of the levy and properly transform the prestige of apprentices, have degree apprentices, transform our careers advice, the way we look at careers and skills in our country, and I think we could then make a lot of progress. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce some distinguished panellists. You've probably got bios with you, but Sandra McNally is Director for the Centre for Vocational Education Research. Alison Fuller is Pro-Director. Now, that's interesting what Pro-Director means, but for Research and Development for the UCL Institute of Education. Has done, all the panel, in fact, have done distinguished work on apprenticeships and skills. John Cope, who've been discussing stats within the green room. It was great that you were in the room. Head of Education and Skills at CBI. Colin, who's coming in a bit. Oh, you've arrived. Oh, well done. Sorry, I hadn't seen you there. I was told you were going to be late. And is the Principal and CEO of Leeds City College. So, Sandra, I'm going to start with you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. First of all, do I go to the podium? Okay, that's... Sorry.
Sorry. Do you want some water?
Yes, please. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and very tough to come after those apprentices in the last session, I have to say. So this is work that, a report that we did as part of CEVA. CEVA is a DFE-funded research centre, and the Sutton Trust. And my co-authors are with me here today, Chiara Cavaglia and Guglielmo Ventura. The report is about, is there an actual earnings premium to having started an apprenticeship over and above alternative options? To begin with, one might want to start with first principles. Why would an apprenticeship be maybe a better form of training than equivalent? There's a really excellent handbook chapter by Stefan Wolter and Paul Ryan that look at all the evidence from apprenticeships around the world. And thinking about, why are apprenticeships such a good thing? I thought the last session for those of us who were here was a very excellent way to see that the way that you learn, the way that you can be motivating, the way that you can integrate theory and practice in jobs in a way that's difficult to do in full-time education, all of that. And while the evidence, international evidence, is a bit mixed about whether apprenticeships actually give you an earnings premium in the longer term, it does seem to increase youth employment rates, and there seems to be better school-to-work transitions in countries that have a big, strong apprenticeship system. However, let's not get oversold about it either. Sometimes apprenticeships doesn't give great content, and there isn't great integration of theory with practice. Now, of course, we don't want our apprenticeships to be like that, but inevitably there will be some variation in how they're implemented in practice, as with all other kinds of education. It doesn't always give superior labour market outcomes for participants. There are some good studies that find that it doesn't have an earnings premium in some contexts. And of course, it's more vulnerable to fluctuations in the economy, because ultimately it's not the government's job to employ apprentices, it's the employer's job to employ apprentices, and government can incentivise that, but it can't make it happen unless it's, of course, in the government itself. Now, when we think about, in England, who are the people who start an apprenticeship, and we're looking back in a few years, so we're using this fantastic administrative data that is in England. That's the National Pupil Database. That's everybody going to schools and state schools in England. You can follow everybody through to further education and higher education if that's where they go. And then you can follow them into the labour market too, and you can look at their earnings. So that's the data that we're looking at. Now, we have to look at people long enough ago that we can really see their earnings in this data. And the longest we can go back is the people who did their GCSEs in 2003. And we can follow them all up in the data up until their age 28, which is in 2015. But what's below in the graph there is just the people who did their GCSE exam, and looking at them in the future, did they ever do an apprenticeship, and what level apprenticeship did they do? And you can see that back for the people who did their GCSEs in 2002, it was about 13% of them who did a level 2 or started a level 2 apprenticeship at some stage. Of course, many don't complete, and it's up to for 18% for people who did their GCSEs in 2008. And for level 3, it's a much smaller number. It's 6% back for those who did their GCSEs in 2002. I'm talking about doing an apprenticeship at any stage afterwards, up to age 28. And it's now about, or in 2008 GCSE cohort, it's about 8%. And level 4, level 5 apprenticeships, those higher apprenticeships, didn't really exist, are a new thing. So they're much more recent, and for that reason it's difficult to actually observe in data what people will learn in the long term, because they just haven't been around long enough for us to actually see people as they progress. Although, of course, it's possible to do some projections and estimation, as people have done. But when we're looking at is there an earnings premium to having an apprenticeship, it is sensible to look at level 2 and level 3, simply because that's where most people who have an apprenticeship, that's the level at which they've done an apprenticeship. And that's what we do for this cohort. So the research question is there an employment or earnings differential from commencing an apprenticeship over and above having a level 2 or level 3 college-based education? Because that is the right counterfactual for those people most of the time. Typically, people who do level 2 or level 3 apprenticeships have average GCSE results that are well beneath those who go to university. That's just a fact in the data. It's not something that I've made up. Maybe it shouldn't be like that. It's just an empirical fact. When we look at the summary statistics for those who start an intermediate or advanced apprenticeship, a couple of things that are striking is that the demographic is different to the cohort on average. It's more likely to be people who are white, people who speak English as a first language, and not people who are eligible for free school meals. So in other words, not the most disadvantaged in the country. And in fact, when you look at advanced apprenticeships, only 7% of those are eligible for free school meals. Advanced apprenticeships are level 3. compared to 14% in the cohort that were eligible for free school meals, which is not unlike what we see for university as well. We see a similar, only a small percentage of people who are eligible for free school meals relative going to university compared to the cohort average. In terms of the GCSE, the people who do intermediate apprenticeships, level 2 apprenticeships to start with, are on average don't do as well at GCSE, and the people who do advanced apprenticeships are much more comparable for men, and for women who are actually a little bit less well performing. And if you look at the percentage of people with a grade C or English and maths, there's a lower percentage of people like that who are doing apprenticeships compared to the average in the cohort. So we're not talking the top of the ability part of the distribution at all, most of the time. In terms of earnings, now this is just raw data, we're not controlling for anything, and what we're looking here at people whose highest level of education is up to level 2, and we're following the cohort that finished their GCSEs in 2003 over time, and as I say, it is everybody who went to state schools. Now, the striking thing about this picture is if you look at men, and you look at, we look at people about 20 months or so after they might have come into the labour market, you see that the earnings trajectory is going up over time. So people are, as you would expect, in your early years in the labour market, you're gaining experience. After a few more years, you earn a bit more. We usually expect an upward earnings trajectory for people as they leave education. For women, it goes very flat very quickly. So there's a very different labour market for men and women who do level 2, regardless of whether or not they have an apprenticeship. It's also, for men, much more visually, it's there. I mean, it's not a huge gap in the raw data, but visually you can see apprenticeship clearly dominates other types of level 2, so that's level 2 getting GCSEs as your highest qualification, or vocational level 2 that you get in a college that doesn't have an apprenticeship component. For women, in the raw data, that's much less clear. Now, for those educated up to level 3, again, there's a difference in men and women in what they earn, but what's really striking is that for level 3 apprenticeships, there's a huge gap in the raw data for men. So it looks like at any particular year, males are earning more conditional on having started a level 3 apprenticeship compared to those who didn't, if their highest qualification was A-levels or if it was a level 3 vocational equivalent in college. For women, it's not the case. You look at the raw data and you don't see it. Now, of course, looking at the raw data is only one thing that you should do. It's only a starting point. What you want to do is you want to estimate an average differential, earnings differential, between those who start an apprenticeship and those who don't start an apprenticeship, controlling for demographics, prior attainment, the secondary school you attended, the sector of learning, your guided learning hours, and your post-education or apprenticeship work experience. So you want to factor in all of those things, and you want to see, well, what happens to the average earnings differential then? And we want to undertake separate analysis for those educated up to level 2 and up to level 3, and men and women separately as well. So, starting off with level 2. Average earnings for men and women, 19,000 and 13,000 respectively, at age 28, okay? So that's for people who just left school with GCSEs as their highest qualification. Now, by age 28, men who started an apprenticeship earn 23% more than those who left school with only GCSEs. So quite a big gap. And that's after taking account all of these other things that we can observe in the data, which of course is imperfect because we can't control for everything, but we're controlling for a lot. And they also earn 16% more than those who left education with a level 2 vocational qualification. Now, for women at age 28, those who started an apprenticeship earn 15% more who left school with only GCSEs, and about 4% more than those who left school with a level 2 vocational education. So for women, the difference between college-based and apprenticeship education at level 2 isn't very big on average. For level 3, there's even a bigger earnings differential for men. So they earn 37% more than those who left education with A-levels as their highest qualification. So no progression beyond that for anybody here by age 28 who earn a lot more than those who who either left education with A levels or who left with a level 3 vocational qualification. And for women who start an apprenticeship, they earn 9% more than those who left education with A levels and didn't progress further, and about 15% more than those who left education with a level 3 vocational qualification. So you can see that apprenticeships on average are a pretty good investment for this cohort, but much more so for men than for women. And it's a hard choice for a woman between looking at vocational full-time or apprenticeship at level 3. There isn't really that much difference on average. Why? Well, the reason is because the specialisation in sectors is completely different for males and females. If you look at level 3 in particular, for men, it's dominated by engineering and manufacturing technologies, which are very well paid, and construction planning in the built environment. For women, at level 3, the predominant sectors are health, public services and care, that's the biggest one, but also retail and commercial enterprise and business administration and law. So that's a really big explanation for why the gender earnings gap is what it is. Now, you might ask, well, advanced apprenticeships for men are so fantastic, in terms of money at least. How do they compare with university degrees? So this is looking at the earnings profile of people who left school, who did their GCSEs in 2003, and you can see the light blue line is those who completed an advanced apprenticeship for men, and the dark blue line is those who completed a degree. So you can see at age 28 in the raw data, they're pretty similar to each other. So very, very similar, but the advanced level 3 apprenticeship still dominates. Now, when you think, well, we're not comparing like with like still, what about engineering degrees compared to engineering apprenticeships? If you look at engineering degrees, people who did an engineering degree actually earn a bit less at age 28 than people with an advanced apprenticeship in engineering. So they're comparing very favourably at that point. Now, when you account for other things, including experience, the differential goes to 0. But, you know, and we don't, of course, know what happens beyond age 28, and we know that most people, it takes them into their 30s to have a better sense of what their lifetime, what their wage differential is going to be in the longer term. So age 28 is too early to stop, but another reason for why one needs to be continuing to do this sort of analysis with Leo, that this is this fantastic data that DFE have. So also an important point is that there are some sectors where at age 28 there is no earnings differential at all on average to having an apprenticeship. These include women educated up to level 2 or level 3 in service enterprises, and childcare at level 3, also affecting women. So it's not that money is everything. There's lots of reasons why doing an apprenticeship may yet be a good thing, particularly at the point of entry to the labour market. But don't tell me that all apprenticeships are going to lead to fantastic earnings in the future. It's not so. It depends which apprenticeship you do and at what level you do it at. So the policy implications of this. The value of an apprenticeship, at least in terms of earnings, is related to both the level and the sector. So when we're thinking about a numerical target, and if we want good earnings prospects for all the people doing an apprenticeship, you might think about how any numerical target is met. Not just whether the target goes up, whether the number goes up or down, but exactly where is it going up, where is it going down. Apprenticeships vary in the extent to which they are a good investment, just like university degrees do, of different types, depending on the institution you go to, depending on the subject or degree you go to. Apprenticeships are like that too. So don't advise students as though they were all the same. We need to have good, sophisticated career guidance, and I would say we should have them right the way through secondary school as a proper subject, not just tagged on at the end as an information advisory. It needs to be far more fundamental than that, especially in the light of the reform of technical education generally, with T-levels coming in and people having to make these big decisions at age 16 with very little prior experience or prior knowledge. So it seems to me that if you're going to have a system that asks people at such a young age to make big decisions like that, you need to have career guidance in schools that's really good, right the way through secondary school. And then finally, inequality of access to high-value apprenticeships is of concern by disadvantage ethnicity and gender. So, of course, that would open up a whole new debate, and so I think I'll stop now.
Thank you very much for that. I think two crucial points came out. Again, the careers. Absolutely, I agree with you. Absolutely fundamental, embedded into the school curriculum. And also what kind of apprenticeship. It's not just about doing an apprenticeship, it's about what kind of apprenticeship you do. So thank you. I hope that your paper will be published on the Sutton Trust website.
It is.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Alison, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank the Sutton Trust for inviting me to speak this morning on apprenticeships, subject very close to my heart. I've been researching it since the early 1990s when the then Tory government introduced the modern apprenticeship. I also want to just say that my co-researcher on this project for the Sutton Trust is Lorna Unwin. Unfortunately, Lorna's not able to be with us today, but we did look at the slides together over the weekend. Our project is focused on apprenticeship policy and provision in England. I think we are talking about England. It's one of those devolved areas of policy, as I'm sure most of you know. And we were looking at existing quality indicators and the extent to which they might facilitate social mobility, particularly focusing on young people. But as I'll show in a moment, there are a lot of older people undertaking apprenticeships in England as well. And as we just acknowledged, the full report is available on the Sutton Trust report accompanying Sandra's. I dug out this quote from some research that Lorna and I did several years ago on apprenticeship. We were doing a bit of historical research. And this company manager at a major engineering company, I think, kind of sums up what apprenticeship can achieve in terms of social mobility when it's high quality. And it's this idea that you can progress from a novice starting point right up to the highest levels within the company, as Sir Peter also alluded to earlier on this morning. So he talked about that in their company and talked about the sense in which there are some changing aspirations out there. And I think that's really important. Young people now aspire to keeping their doors open. They aspire to careers which are going to take them on a career journey that will yield high wage returns, but also high levels of job satisfaction. And for that, they might want to have a diet of education and training that's perhaps what we might call hybrid, that includes ongoing general education as well as training for occupational expertise. And the best apprenticeships that we see through our qualitative research do indicate that. So the first point that I want to make is that good quality apprenticeships have always been associated with social mobility for young people. It's an age-old work-based model of learning for expertise that continues to be used throughout the world, in Europe, as we've heard, but well across the other continents as well. And when it's done well, it really can scaffold an individual to become a recognised skilled worker, be autonomous in terms of their practice and autonomous in terms of their financial independence. And for the employer, it's renewing capacity, it's enabling the organisation to move forward with new blood, intergenerational change and exchange from more experienced workers to less experienced. So apprenticeship is expected to make its contribution to social mobility, and that's absolutely right. So whilst I'm going to focus on some concerns about quality and their implications for social mobility, I do want to highlight that there is the most outstanding practice out there. We've certainly seen it in our research, and of course it's represented in this room as well, and we've heard about 3 fantastic examples this morning from our apprentices. The issue is consistency, I think, and kind of the quality of the system. So what we did was we reviewed the international research evidence on apprenticeship quality. We looked at how apprenticeship policy has evolved in this country and the key reforms that have been undertaken to try and enhance quality itself. That research has focused on a range of sectors, and as Sandra said, sectors are incredibly important in this debate. And we also looked at the publicly available statistics on patterns of participation, which are widely available and enable you to see who's starting an apprenticeship by gender, black and minority ethnic background, equality, diversity, and so on, and across sectors and levels. So what does the international research literature tell us about apprenticeship and how it might be defined, and what might count as apprenticeship? And I think that's one of the ongoing debates we have in this country. What should count as an apprenticeship and what shouldn't? Is all training an apprenticeship? Are all jobs suitable for apprenticeship? Those kinds of big questions. Well, the international literature, we extracted these key points. That an apprenticeship will develop a clear occupational identity. It'll develop durable and broad-based skills that will enable somebody to progress within their occupation and within their sector, and are recognised more widely than just in the organisation in which they achieve their apprenticeship. And that's because they are designed to facilitate somebody to achieve nationally recognised standards in their sector or industry. And that's certificated so that there's some kind of sense of collective understanding about the meaning of the value of that training and qualification. Fourthly, that it requires well-trained vocational teachers and trainers. And as many of you will know, these are the unsung heroes really in our education system, both in the workplace and in the college and provider sector, where you have really, really good vocational education trainers and teachers. You tend to get good quality experiences. But there's not very much data about that, and there's not very much clarity about how those people are trained, and more of them are unable to reach those high standards. And also the last point is key, that we see that, that apprenticeship as defined in terms of quality in the international literature talks a lot about partnership and cooperation between employers, providers, individuals, often trades unions, sometimes called the social partners on the continent. So I just want to put a few statistics in the room. I'm not an economist like Sandra, but from the publicly available statistics, you can glean some incredibly important top-line data. So these ones are taken from 1617, so they've been slightly updated from the statistics in our report for the Sutton Trust, which was based all on 1516. And what we see here is just shy of 500,000 starts, which is a drop, as many of you will know, based on the stats in 1516, which has been linked to the introduction of the levy. What you'll also see there is that the largest group by age are those who start an apprenticeship aged 25 plus, followed by the group from 19 to 24, followed by the group aged under 19. So for the person in the street who doesn't know much about apprenticeship, who will conjure up the idea of a young school leaver being the apprentice population, actually the picture in England is somewhat different to that, and the largest group who are starting are 25 plus. Also interesting to see that the majority starting now are female. Again, traditionally, apprenticeships have been associated with more with a male community, but now we see females in the ascendancy. And that, of course, is to do with the changing industrial profile in the country, the growth of service sectors, the decline in engineering and manufacturing. And what we see is 86% of starts now being in service sectors, which, of course, are the dominant employing sectors in the economy as a whole. And the last point I just want to make and to really highlight is that estimates vary between sort of 2/3 and 70+ % of people who start an apprenticeship are already employed. And they're employed and then as an apprentice in the job that they're currently holding. So that can have a distorting effect on analyses of wages, because people don't take a wage drop to go into an apprenticeship. And it can also, I think, be quite challenging for people who are really wanting to develop apprenticeships for young people as their first opportunity to get into work, and really raises some questions about quality in terms of added value and dead weight. So level, here again, we see that the majority of starts are at level 2. Traditionally and typically an apprenticeship is conceived as a training pathway to skilled work, as I mentioned in the first slide, and kind of the ability to be autonomous. And in terms of the levels, that's normally associated with a good level 3. But here we see that the majority of our starts are at semi-skilled level, at level 2. Raises big questions about progression. We do see just under 10% of starts now at level 4 to 6. Of course, as we know, these higher level apprenticeships and degree level apprenticeships are much newer than the level 2 and the level 3. But when we look at the sectors, we can see that the 7% are mostly in management-related frameworks, particularly in childcare management and others, but management-related frameworks. So I think there's a question here about apprenticeship and its contribution to productivity, as well as the questions about social mobility that we've been talking about. That the critique of the economy that's been made in terms of productivity is that we don't have enough skills at level 3, 4, and 5, the kind of sub-bachelor level. And at the moment, the apprenticeship statistics indicate that we have some way to go to ensure that apprenticeship's really making its contribution in that regard. So in terms of sector, I picked out the first 3, that they're very big apprenticeship sectors, very highly populated apprenticeship sectors. Health and social care is by far the biggest now. And as you can see, the majority of starts are at level 2 in those sectors. When you look at construction skills and engineering, which are clearly very traditional in terms of skilled trades and technical level occupations, we see very high level 2 in construction. I think that's partly to do with changes in technology and the way that the buildings are constructed and so on. We had our coffee in that amazing room upstairs with the wood panelling and the plaster, decorative plaster and so on. You can imagine all the apprentices that were working on that back in the day, but of course things have changed now in terms of construction, the way we construct things. In engineering, you can see that it's far fewer of the starts are at level 2, which I think does reflect a tradition in apprenticeship which is still really operating the scheme as a vehicle for achieving skilled workers. However, of course, the numbers are not particularly high, and they've remained flat for some years. And I think that reflects to some extent the weak demand in the economy, particularly in some low-paid service sectors. And again, this presents challenges for the ability of apprenticeship to really support social mobility in the way that I think we'd all like to see. The gender profile is uneven. It's quite interesting that the older you get in terms of the age groups and starts, the more it's likely to be female. And that young women are predominantly, when I say young women here, I'm talking under 19, predominantly in children's care, learning and development, and hairdressing. Engineering is dominated by males, and there, of course, we see a lot of the reason for the difference in wage differentials that Sandra outlined. So, measuring and improving quality for social mobility. Well, we go into this in the report in some detail. But the Institute for Apprenticeships has talked about collecting evidence in two kind of broad ways in order to help it to evaluate quality. First of all, in terms of quantitative evidence, it's picked out 3 measures, all quantitative. The first is the wage gain of apprenticeship after apprenticeships, and we heard some of the evidence earlier this morning on that. But I would want to just caution around the effect of conversions on that. As I said, people don't take a wage cut to convert into being an apprentice, so we do see some effects of people who are already in jobs on the level of wages. The ratio of apprentice completions to start and the success in the recently introduced endpoint assessment with the new standards. I mean, here I think the key is that we use it to raise questions about why achievement might vary by geography, age, gender, prior attainment and so on. And the third one's days of off the job. We now have this 20% mandatory requirement. What I would say there is it's really important to look at how that 20% is being accounted for, what it consists of, and also triangulate that with qualitative evidence about the experience, the lived experience of an apprenticeship. And then the last bit is really a lot of weight now and a lot of responsibility is placed for gleaning evidence about quality on the inspection regime, on Ofsted in particular, and then on HEFCE and its agencies for the higher degree apprenticeships and degree apprenticeships. So the IFA is going to need to rely quite heavily on Ofsted and on HEFCE. And as Robert said, we really need to look at the extent to which the Ofsted and the inspectors are adequately resourced in order to discharge that responsibility and to really give us good quality evidence, including, for example, on the quality of teaching and learning in apprenticeships and the quality of vocational teachers. So why is this a challenge? And I would say it's a challenge for all countries. There's big debates going on in Germany, Switzerland, Denmark, Australia, Canada and other countries around the need to develop their apprenticeships and increase the amount of good quality offers. And a key challenge is the demand in the economy from employers, those willing to invest in growing their own skills. Of course, the levy has been introduced to try and kickstart that after a number of years of decline. But as employers in this room will know who are investing very heavily in apprenticeship and really trying to do things, it's not easy and it requires a lot of thinking and reflecting on practices of recruitment, practices of development, who you're recruiting and what kind of pathways there might be available for them. The shift to the service-based economy is somewhat of a challenge, given that we don't have the same tradition as some other countries in having apprenticeships in the service sectors. So we're having to really learn what a good quality means in some of these sectors. We heard, I think, today from our 3 apprentices about examples of commercially based apprenticeships in the service sectors that sounded extremely strong. But at the moment, I think we have examples as opposed to a strong system and consistency across the piece. The extent to which we've got demand for the advanced skills, there is controversy in the literature about this. We know that we have what the OECD has called an hourglass type of profile. We have a lot of demand for semi-skilled, and that's reflected in some of these start statistics. We have a lot of demand at the higher level. How can we really populate that middle part of the economy and therefore provide a really strong ladder for people coming up from below through the work-based routes that's going to scaffold them and enable them to progress? And of course we have the competition with the higher education sector, which has expanded so enormously over the last 10 or 20 years and has traditionally promised better outcomes for social mobility. And the extent to which that's a reality, particularly post very high fees or a perception, it's something which apprenticeships clearly have to contend with. So a number of issues, and I'm coming towards the end now. I think we have to question whether any job role or any workplace is suitable for an apprenticeship. The kind of model we have at the moment does assume that, and I think it is part of the reason why we have so much inconsistency, as evidenced by a number of reports and including Ofsted inspections. We have concerns about the segmented model of apprenticeship, level 2, level 3, level 4, and so on and so forth. I think in terms of transaction costs, that can be expensive if people are doing numbers of apprenticeships in order to get to their end point of occupational expertise. I think there's also a danger that there can be glass ceilings introduced where people think they might be able to progress, but unless there's a job available with a higher level of skill attached, they won't be able to. The content of apprenticeship, I think, can be looked at again in terms of whether it's really providing in all cases a sufficient platform for progression, and also looking at the issue of conversion, which might help to deliver numbers in terms of the ability to credit people for skills which they pretty much already got, but it's not clear that the extent to which they'll be giving opportunities to develop new skills. So to achieve better quality, what do we need to do? I think there is a major challenge and exercise to really try and build capacity within workplaces and across these partnerships, which we've heard a bit about this morning, but which really do need some investment and time in which to create that capacity to deliver apprenticeships at scale and at the quality that we all want to see. I think we really need to still focus on the intermediate and advanced, ensuring that they're very good quality and providing that platform for progression on up. And I think there is a slight danger that the focus on degree apprenticeships maybe switch attention from these other apprenticeships where the majority of apprentices are found. I'd like to see Ofsted developing a style of inspections which is developmental and formative in orientation as well as summative, and particular focus to ensure that those who are converting to apprenticeships are being able to gain significant new skills. So just a few recommendations from our report. I think all apprenticeships should include nationally recognised qualifications, and that's one of the most contentious areas when we think about the new Trailblazer standards. To what extent are they going to be including those? And we know that there's been a lot of disquiet in the employer and provider community about national policy on that. The funding, I think we do need to look at, particularly when we're trying to increase uptake by disadvantaged groups and uptake by young people. And in that regard, we need to look at the non-levy paying employer sector as well as the levy paying, which was mentioned earlier on. The data, we can still improve on that, looking at highest educating attainment prior to apprenticeship and the extent to which they're taken up by different groups. So we can look at who's getting what opportunities. We need more advanced apprenticeship opportunities because those really, as we saw with the wage differentials, are those that give the greatest chance to provide opportunities that will deliver financial independence and career progression. And I think we need more qualitative research on apprenticeships to look at the lived experience from the point of view of individuals, employers and providers, as well as the quantitative patterns of progression. We need that triangulation between those different methods. And of course, just to finish, really the economy provides the lifeblood for good quality apprenticeships. The more good quality jobs we have, the more opportunity we have to really find good quality apprenticeships, and those apprenticeships that will lead to that social mobility that we're all here to try and support. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. I think just a couple of things that came out of that was particularly the conversions issue, and I think what you said and the impact on wages and weight I think is important, and then progression and quality. So that was really helpful. We now pass on to John Cope, who is just joined not so long the CBI as Head of Education and Skills.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you for all you do to bang the drum for apprenticeships. I often think I have the best job at the CBI. Head of Education and Skills is a fantastic role. Education and skills is the number one domestic policy issue that our 190,000 members raise with us. It's the number one driver of productivity, and it's the number one driver of social justice. And anyone who has run a business will know that a diverse and inclusive business filled with people from different backgrounds is a good business. Every year, the CBI does a pulse check of education and business to understand how they're interacting. This is our education skills survey. One of the most stark statistics that come out of it is that 60% of businesses can't get people they need with the right skills they want. And 75% of businesses predict that they will need higher levels of skills in the future, but don't know where they're coming from. A lot of this 75% of higher skills is the higher technical qualifications. It's the level 3, 4, 5 apprenticeships and technical education. And all of these pressures will be amplified not only by Brexit, which amazingly hasn't featured yet so far, the B word, the fourth industrial revolution, the march of automation and artificial intelligence. Each of these will add extra pressures to a labour market and mean that young people and people in the workplace will need to be more agile, with more transferable skills, and often have to change job more regularly than in the past. So what is clear is that business values technical education. It values the higher skills that it brings, and it values the skills that can be applied in the workplace. One thing though, however, comes very clear is that business feels skills policy is often overlooked, or it suffers from constant change. Over the last 30 years or so, there have been about 30 skills ministers and about 15 secretaries of state for education, of all different parties, of course. And during that period, there's been initiative, there's been change, there's been reform, there's been new pots of money appearing, things disappearing. And what business values actually is the stability. It's understanding that when a young person comes with a qualification, they know what that qualification means and they know what that young person will be able to do. So the three things that I would say are often overlooked is that coherency of the system. It's the lack of careers guidance and information. And of course, the need to reform the apprenticeship levy. So on that first point, on the coherency, if you were to ask a young person to describe to you what's their pathway in academics, most likely at the age of sort of 13, 14, 15, 16, because after all, you can go to UTC now at 13. They will be able to describe it to you. They'll be able to tell you they'll do their GCSEs, they'll do their A-levels, get their bachelor's, maybe even a master's. If you were to ask them to describe the same pathway in technical education, they'd probably struggle. They'd find it hard to explain what their horizon is, what they're aiming for, how they get there, and all the elements that go in it. Now, there's a fantastic example of where this exact approach has been sort of taken on in Sheffield, where there's an informal, bordering on formal relationship between Sheffield College and Sheffield Hallam University, where they've taken on that pathway. The college accepts its strengths are in 1 to 5 level qualifications, and then the university takes it from there. And young people are given that trajectory. They can go to college, then they can go on to Sheffield Hallam University, and that's presented to them as a joined-up pathway. Now, that required local initiative, and that required that sort of approach. But actually, on a national level, it's incredibly patchy. Now, we're not too far away from that sort of system, with T-levels coming in and with degree apprenticeships taking hold. But actually, until there is that pathway, academic and technical, that business recognises, that parents recognise, that young people recognise and understand, there'll always be a disparity between the pathways. And of course, not only should they be coherent pathways, they should also be interchangeable pathways. At the age of 13, if you decide to go to UTC, that should not be a case that you are then stuck on a technical route. You should be able to change your mind. And if you go down an academic route, you should also be able to change your mind. And thinking rather boldly, you should be able to do both at the same time, in our view. What business values is not just academic ability and qualifications, it also values behaviours, aptitudes and applicability of that knowledge. So actually, as somebody who comes along who has both a technical education and an academic grounding is incredibly valuable. The second point I mentioned around careers guidance, now Rob mentioned this earlier and it's come up a few times in the other speakers. The idea of a UCAS for FE feels like a good idea, but to go back to that point I just made about coherency, it feels to me the idea of setting up a whole new pathway, making it strictly FE, probably might not be the best idea. Actually, for UCAS to consider technical education on a par with academic is probably a better way of going about it and brings that coherency. The third point is around the apprenticeship levy. Now, the CBI and the rest of the business representative organisations, and Rob mentioned the EF, support the apprenticeship levy, but it's clear that it's broken at the moment. It's letting down young people. It's actually holding business back. I've already said about how business values skills training and apprenticeships. They're being prevented from doing that by the way the apprenticeship levy is set up. And there is a big change, I think, in the conversation. Up until about 6 months ago or so, it was a case of hold tight, the statistics will right themselves, things will get better, business will adapt, young people will adapt, and the system will adapt. Well, that's not happened. The apprenticeship starts have still fallen. And until it moves from an issue that the financial director of a business is having to deal with to the in-tray of the HR director, in other words, the levy gains the confidence of business, stops being a payroll tax and being seen as something that's holding skills training back, and is actually seen as a skills policy, the levy will need reform. Now, in the short term, there are three areas that the CBI and a lot of the other business representation organisations are focusing on. They are quality, usability and flexibility. On the quality point, this is again 3 million target. 3 million starts. Emphasis on the word starts. At the moment, the government is trying to get 3 million apprenticeship starts, which doesn't include actual finishers. It doesn't require quality. It's just an arbitrary target. So however admirable it might be, actually a target like that is not always helpful. The most important shift on quality is the change from apprenticeship frameworks to apprenticeship standards. Now, this is being led by the Institute for Apprenticeships. Frameworks were often strict. They had a very arbitrary endpoint assessment where it was a case of how many hours have you done and things like that, and then you pass your apprenticeship, whereas standards are a totally different approach and aimed at raising quality. The issue with this change from frameworks to standards has simply been the glacial pace by which it's gone. This week we are recognising the 300th apprenticeship standard being agreed. The IFA predict that we'll need roughly 700 or so standards. Now, it's taken 2 years to get to 300, potentially take another 2 years to get to 700. The horizon on spending your levy funds was 18 months, and after a lot of discussion has been raised to 2 years. But that does mean that actually some of these standards aren't getting in place. Businesses can't access high quality apprenticeships in time for their levy funds to be spent. And it also raises the question of why 700? Why do we need 700 apprenticeship standards? Why isn't it 50 or why is it not 2,000? In Germany there are 300 standards, and that's largely aligned to the German definitions of roles and jobs in the economy and the international standards. But it does raise the question why we're aiming for 700, especially when we have 15 pathways as T-levels. The opposite logic appears to be being applied, with T-levels wanting fewer pathways. Apprenticeship standards, we're aiming for 700. The second point is around usability of the system, and this is the biggest headache for business. At the moment, the system actually is bureaucratic, it's filled with red tape. The online account system don't actually let businesses do the training they want to. The issue of 20% off the job has been raised. A lot of that is down to miscommunication, and the government has done a good job in correcting that. Even though it's a mandatory requirement for 20% off the job, that doesn't necessarily mean all at once in strict blocks, and it doesn't necessarily mean actually off-site. It can be on-site. So that's a welcome change. The other point about usability is around legitimate costs. So what can you actually spend your levy on? At the moment, it's very strict. We're pushing for it to be used on setting up provision, for salary costs, for infrastructure, and other such costs. And then finally, on flexibility. Now, this is where there's the most movement has been from government around the concepts of transfers and the CBI's proposal for the next stage in transfers around pooling. Transfers is in essence being able to transfer some small amount of your levy funds, 10% at the moment, to your supply chain, to other businesses, to sort of make the system more flexible. The CBI's proposal, and it hopefully will be piloted quite soon, actually is to follow the government's trajectory. It start 10% a transfer to one business, and Milton in her speech last week changed that to multiple businesses, but still 10%. Our argument is that that should go to 50% to actually allow greater flexibility. But actually, transfer is still about one business transferring its funds to another. So our proposal is to change that to pooling, where businesses still hold on to the money and can actually create their own provision, again, at that 50% level. Many of you will be well aware of CITB or maybe Cogent, similar sector bodies. At the moment, they're double levy payers in essence. You have to pay your CITB levy, you also have to pay the apprenticeship levy. Now, what pooling would allow is for businesses to pool 50% of their levy funds in a joint venture, a legal agreement, sharing risk but maintaining control of their levy funds into organisations like CITB. Because at the moment, to use an example, if you're a small business especially, and you go to your local college and you want a level 4, 5, level 6, level 7, whatever it may be, apprenticeship, and it doesn't provide it, and the closest provision is 400 miles away, what do? There is no mechanism actually for employers to force provision to make the market react to them. What pooling allows is businesses to say the provision is not high quality enough, it doesn't exist, or we actually, as a group of employers, want to innovate and we want to create our own apprenticeship. So pooling would allow exactly that. And now, those three are our short-term goals. The long-term goal is a more flexible skills fund, moving away from just working on apprenticeships, but creating that coherency. So actually allowing the levy and allowing the funds that are collected to be spent on the placements that are be part of T-levels, to be spent on traineeships, to be spent on just-in-time training, where a skills gap appears and the business can see it coming. They send the young person on a couple of weeks training course to address it. Now, that's what business wants, that long-term sort of solution of a flexible skills fund. Now, the take and give there is that actually in order for that to happen, of course, the apprenticeship levy has to work, has to stop preventing apprenticeship starts. But then the carrot there is that if it does become much wider, the business may potentially have to pay more, to go beyond the 0.5% of the payroll payment at the moment, and actually start looking at 0.6, 0.7%. Obviously, that's a conversation a long way down the line. It's when the apprenticeship levy is working and the T-levels are in place. So in conclusion, business backs skills and values them and always will do. It's what makes a business work is the quality of its people. And it supports the apprenticeship levy in principle, but at the moment it's preventing apprenticeship starts. And if we carry on, we will get there. All the elements are in place. The T-levels, the apprenticeship levy, they're all there. The levy just needs reforming and the system needs to become coherent. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that. I think you had some very important ideas of reform of the levy. I agree with you that a UCAS FE mustn't be exclusive to FE skills and apprenticeships. It should include universities as well, but it should be focused on skills. And that the only thing I would have a question about is you suggesting that the levy should be used as a general skills pot as opposed to apprentice pot. And my only reservations about that is my hope is that we really build an apprenticeship nation and have apprenticeships as other countries do. And I think if you dilute that and say it can be used for other skills pots, it might weaken that aim. But nevertheless, many of your levy proposals are important, and I'm sure the government are considering them. I sadly have to go now, but Colin, you moved very quickly. Yeah, no, we're going to have another. John has kindly agreed to chair in my absence, so I apologise for that. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Okay, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Colin Booth. I'm CEO and Principal of Leeds City College Group. And I'm going to give you some kind of reflections around personal experience, both as an individual and as the leader of actually 3 colleges I currently lead, and a group of secondary schools as well. But 2 of the 3 colleges that I'm responsible for deliver apprenticeships. And I'll come back to that later in kind of contrasting the 2. I'm going to take you, I'm going to reflect back a lot further than that and say that actually I come from a culture, a time and a place where becoming an apprentice was a significant aspiration. So before I left school actually, which is interesting, so before I got my O-level results, I was applying to be an apprentice and remember going to an interview at a fairly high-profile local engineering company with 20 other 15 or 16-year-olds and being interviewed for 2 places as an engineering apprentice. So I failed that interview and therefore had to go and take A-levels and end up at university. So my first aspiration was being an apprentice. And actually I failed to do that and ended up doing A-levels and going to university. And actually when I finished university and decided to do teacher training, the first thing, my first 4 years of teaching was teaching apprentices general studies. So in the old system in the 1980s, all apprentices were on day release, 1 day a week, and they had to do general studies. And I spent 4 years teaching general studies to apprentices. And I taught motor vehicle mechanics, engineers, hairdressers, a whole range of different professions. What I remember from that is, which is in contrast to what we've heard today, is that in 4 years of teaching apprentices, and when I was applying to be an apprentice, apprenticeships were about young people. In 4 years, I don't think I taught anybody over the age of about 22 in the 1980s on a whole range of apprenticeship provision. And that was a kind of a real challenge. The oldest group I think I taught was, as a 26-year-old, was a group of scaffolders and roofers. And given that the general studies curriculum included sex education, as a 26-year-old trying to teach a group of 22-year-old roofers sex education was a significant challenge to my teaching skills at the time. So apprenticeships used to be about young people in their first or new job. And it was all about recognised qualifications. So those are 2 things that I think should be a real priority within the system. I'm not saying it's exclusively that, but certainly in Leeds City Region at the moment, when we look at the data tells us that the only increase in apprenticeship starts is from 25-year-olds doing higher level qualifications. So that's where the increase is at the moment, certainly regionally and locally to where I run colleges. And I'm not against that. I'm just saying that actually there's something that resonates about apprenticeships being mainly about young people in their first or new jobs. And there is a lot of dead weight in 25 plus and higher level apprenticeships, particularly in students studying for MBAs and degrees. So higher level apprenticeships, my view, the majority should be at level 4 and level 5 and should be progression routes for young people moving into technical areas of expertise in the workplace. I was asked to kind of reflect on some challenges for providers. Challenges, the levy system is long term, so a challenge for all colleges certainly is having long-term relationships with levy-paying employers in particular, but all employers, because I think the key to this for colleges and providers is having long-term relationships with your employers, or one of the keys. One of the other things that's a real challenge is actually the attitudes of our own staff. And I'll highlight this by saying, referring back, I said I was responsible for 2 colleges. So one of those colleges is much better at delivering apprenticeships than the other or has been recently. So whilst apprenticeship numbers have been declining nationally, one of the colleges that I run, they've been increasing. And if I dig down into that and find the reasons for those increases, actually the most significant reason is in one or two curriculum areas, and engineering in particular, they're excellent at moving their full-time students on into apprenticeships. Now that's fairly unusual in the college sector. Most of my staff, most of my curriculum staff, particularly those at Leeds City College, the other college I run that deals with apprentices is Keighley College, most of those staff want to retain full-time students to be full-time students the following year, which is great. But not many are good at progressing people into apprenticeships. When I went up to Keighley and was walking around and talking to staff and students, I walked into engineering to have a look at what they were doing with their full-time engineering groups. And I could only find 2 students. That's because we only have 2 students left on full-time education programmes. Every other student on those programmes has progressed in year to be an apprentice. So we're still teaching them all, but we only have 2 students left towards the end of that programme. Now that's facilitated by programme managers and staff who used to be apprentices themselves, who are excellent at progressing students into apprenticeships. It's facilitated by the fact that there's alignment between the qualifications, so it's easy to progress from a full-time programme into an apprenticeship. So I need to get more of my staff to be able to do more of that. That brings me on to T-levels really, because T-levels should help us do that. But one of my reflections on T-levels is at the moment, when I look at T-levels, they would even if we shifted everybody that we could do into the eventual T-levels in the colleges that I run, that would still be less than half of the vocational students. So I'm just interested in how successful T-levels are, and then how many vocational students actually move across into T-levels, which theoretically should give us a better alignment and better progression into apprenticeships, or certainly opportunities for our students to progress into apprenticeships. A lot of that would be driven by the quality of work experience with employers. So work experience with employers, giving students the experience they need to either choose apprenticeships or perhaps choose a full-time programme that's T-level and then progress into apprenticeships. At the moment in Leeds City region, about a third of employers, just below the national average, have any engagement whatsoever with young people and any kind of work experience. And that includes short-term work experience and then simply showing young people around the workplace. The number of employers, or the proportion of employers engaged in long-term or significant work placements is very small indeed when you look at it as a percentage of all employers. Now, if we're going to get better at progressing our students into apprenticeships, going to get better at progressing them from T-levels into apprenticeships, if we're going to get better at that careers advice as well and guidance and giving young people a rounded experience to make those choices from, we need to get more employers engaged in significant work placements. I'll reflect what John said about the approvals for new standards being slow. And just as a simple case study that highlights the problems both as an employer and a provider, if we look at the main teaching qualification for teaching and further education, we've been waiting for that standard for about 18 months. As a provider, I had a whole cohort of teachers go through what theoretically would have been that apprenticeship because we started it in anticipation of the standard being available last September. So In the end, we received no funding for that cohort at all because we did it at risk. So that cost us about £150,000 that we didn't secure funding for, simply because we started it when we thought the standard would be available, but it never became available. And we're now about to go through that again with this September starts. Given how difficult it is to attract and retain teachers in subjects like engineering and maths, I have people on a waiting list for that apprenticeship to teach engineering and maths. So as an employer, I have people who want to be maths and engineering teachers, who want to train with me as an apprentice, and the standard simply isn't available. One thing that hasn't been mentioned, Leeds City College is a large regional college, and we have some large contracts with both national and regional employers for levy payers for apprenticeships. And one thing we've learnt over the last kind of year, 18 months, is that can present its own challenges as well as being a great opportunity, and we're really happy to be successful having some national contracts. But I'll give you a straightforward example with one employer where they represented, because it was a national contract, more than half of our planned apprenticeship starts in that curriculum area, and then decided to have a national restructuring of their staff and delay their planned 200 starts by 6 months, at which point I'm left with a national network of teachers and assessors to deliver that, and no income for 6 months. So we've got a lot more cautious at how we plan apprenticeships when we've got large contracts now. And John also referred to stability and efficiency in relation to the bureaucracy that surrounds the funding system, which is a challenge for us as a provider and managing that. It's also a challenge for employers, and what's frustrating as a provider is trying to negotiate the rules around how we can help employers, because the rules are quite strict on that. So we want to help employers negotiate the bureaucracy more, but it's quite difficult to be allowed to do that. I also note that I was at an audit committee meeting last week, and I dislike audit reports that give me recommendations for things to do intensely. And had an audit report that said for our apprenticeship system we do need to make some changes to comply with the national rules. But the auditors then went on to say, actually, you're one of the better providers that we've audited on this. And the underlying reason is the number of changes in the national rules and the ability to keep up with them. So they formally reported that back. And whilst I don't want any recommendations, and I'm sure we need to get better, I do note that actually keeping up with the number of changes has been quite difficult over the last year or so. Having said that, the system is settling down a bit, and I think there's always a lag in how the numbers come through nationally, and probably a bigger lag because it takes longer than it used to get apprentices onto the system. However, certainly in our experience, apprenticeship starts are now rising for us in both colleges. They still haven't overtaken where we were before, but nevertheless they're rising again after falling for some time. I was asked in the brief to give some policy asks, so here's a few big policy asks. First policy ask is that all of the levy funding is actually spent on education and training. That's fairly broad. I didn't say apprenticeships, I just said education and training. So that's the first ask. And that's important because the levy actually replaced general taxation in paying for apprenticeships. So to not spend all of that money on education training of some description would be another effective cut in the national funding for skills. And I think that most people would like to think that the levy was additional money into the skills system, not either the same or a reduction. So in order to achieve that, we would have to at least make sure that all of the levy funding goes on some kind of education or training. And actually, I would agree with John's last point when he said if the levy is going to be used for things like infrastructure or salaries or whatever, then we would need to increase the levy or increase the number of employers it applied to. Otherwise, again, we have an effective cut in the amount of funding into skills, training and education in the country, which I think is the wrong direction. I also think that the levy should be primarily about funding education and training and apprenticeships in particular for younger people. So we should think about where the significant increases are at the moment and how we direct more funding at younger cohorts, and particularly about where the biggest increase in higher apprenticeship programmes are in terms of MBAs and degree levels, and refocus that on level 4 and 5 technical education, which is what I believe that people think the system should be about. Not only that, actually level 4 and level 5 technical education is the biggest skills gap in terms of higher level education in this country. We have a higher education system that has shifted all the way towards 3-year academic degrees as the prime way of growing things, and actually we've got an increasing gap at level 4 and 5 that's been there for 60 or 70 years in this country.
Colin, just to say, because we need to go for a break.
Yeah, sure. Okay, 30 seconds.
Thank you.
Okay. Next thing is to get more employers engaged with work placements and supporting progression from full-time education into apprenticeships. And finally, and then highlighting what all of the speakers have said, it's not about volume, it's about quality. Volume will come later if the quality is there long term. So I would highlight as a policy ask that everything is focused on ensuring we have high quality apprenticeships for the long term. Then we'll get the volume. Thank you.